What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video. Today's gonna be a little bit different. We're changing the pace up a little bit. Reason for that is on my Instagram and my TikTok, I've gotten countless comments and countless DMs, people saying, hey, how much does it cost to actually S54 swap an E30? So that's why I'm sitting down today and breaking it down with you guys and answering how much it costs to S54 swap your E30. Now, if you guys don't know, my name is Julian Dinino. This is my 1989 BMW 325 IS with an S54 swap in it. And there's a 2002 back there. And in my garage, there is an Alpine White E90, which you guys can't see right now, but I'll throw a picture up on the screen. Last night, I made a list for the cost breakdown on the S54 swap. Being is what I do for a living, and the people that I know, I get a lot of parts for a lot less money than others would pay for, and I know a lot of people, so I get a lot of good deals. And number one, to S54 swap your E30, you're gonna need an S54. A reasonable price to pay for an S54 these days is around $6,000. If you can find one for $5,000, you're getting a really good deal, but most of the times they're gonna get up to $6,000, $7,000, and maybe even $8,000 depending on the mileage. In my situation, I paid $2,000 for this engine, which is a really good deal for an S54, but also I didn't know if this one ran. So I took it all apart, and if you guys wanna look on the channel, I have a full build series on the S54 alone, just rebuilding it. Took the head off, had the head decked, had all the parts cleaned. Then I did rod bearings, timing chain guides, timing chains, basically all the maintenance stuff for an S54. I just replaced it all when I was in there. My engine was $2,000. All the parts to do the rebuild, like the rod bearings, the head gasket, all the different gaskets that I needed, that was $1,200. The machine work was $500. I needed to get the head decked, and I also got everything cleaned. The tools cost me $300 because you need to have a set of tools to time an S54. It's really hard to time S54s without that tool. It's a tool that sits over the top of the head, and then there's a pin that drops down through each cam to properly make sure the cams are at TDC. You need the crank lock pin to lock the crank in TDC, so that's around $300. So the first thing, after you have your S54, whether you got one that was blown up and rebuilt it, or you got a good running one, once you have it and once you're ready to put it into the E30, one big modification you have to make to it, and that's the oiling system. Many of you guys know the E30 comes with the M20 B25 engine, and that is a front sump engine, and the E46 and all E36 engines have a rear sump engine. The subframe in this car is made to have a front sump instead of a rear sump. The E34 525i has an M50, which that oil pan will bolt to this engine, and that is a front sump oil pan. So you're gonna need one of those, or you can get a very expensive kit which modifies your subframe and modifies your oil pan so you can retain the rear sump. But because I'm a fabricator, I had an E34 oil pan. I didn't want my oil pan to be dragging the ground, so I cut the bottom off my oil pan, raised the oil pan up, and I widened it. You guys don't have to get that done, but I would recommend doing that. I wanted to modify my oil pan so I would have more ground clearance, because as you guys can tell, my car is pretty low. E34 oil pans, you used to be able to get them for $200 to $300. Now expect to pay $500 for the pickup tube, the dipstick, and the oil pan. The fuel pump, you're gonna need an upgraded fuel pump because the stock E30 fuel pump won't be able to keep up with the S54. I have a Walbro 225. That fuel pump is around $200. You're gonna need a fuel pressure regulator if you guys didn't get it with your engine. The fuel pressure regulator is gonna be about $200. Didn't have an alternator for my engine, so I had to buy one for $300. And then all my belts and pulleys I had to buy, and that was $170. But so that's pretty much gonna cover everything just on the engine. Now let's move to the driveline. I should have said this at the beginning of the video. My car was already swapped. I already had an M52 in my car, so I already had my engine mounts, I already had the engine arms, clutch, flywheel, and transmission. So I pretty much had everything to bolt an S54 into this car. I already had a ZF5 speed, so I used the ZF5 speed in an E36 drive shaft. A ZF5 speed now, expect to pay between $300 to $600 depending on how good of a deal you find for it. E36 drive shaft, expect to pay about $200. For the clutch and flywheel, I forget what brand of clutch and flywheel I have. I have a 6-puck racing clutch that's sprung and a Sachs pressure plate, and then I have a lightweight flywheel. A good, decent clutch and flywheel setup will run you about $1,000. E36 engine arms, you're gonna need them. You can't use the E46 M3 engine arms. You can't use your stock engine mounts either. You have to get aftermarket engine arms for a 24 valve swap for an E30, and transmission mounts, which those will run you about $150. Now that is your drivetrain fully mounted into your car and bolted up. Now let's move on to cooling. This part was really expensive. I'm going to be driving this car on the track. It gets hot here in Pittsburgh during the summers, and I'm gonna have my fun with this car during the summer. So I opted big on cooling. I got a CSF radiator, that was $575. I got a CSF oil cooler, that was $550. I got oil cooler lines, that was $160. Cooling hoses, that was around $250. Cooling fan, that was $150. So that's pretty much all the stuff you're gonna need for the cooling on this car. I wanna touch on this real quick. I do have an E46 M3 CSF radiator. I wouldn't get an E46 M3 radiator because it's physically too wide for the E30. So I had to cut and modify stuff, which I wouldn't recommend doing. I'd rather get an E36 radiator that bolts directly into the E30. But that's pretty much everything for cooling. And I can hear my friend Matt coming up the hill in his E30. Look at this goober. His car is way too loud. I'm back after my friend Matt just stopped over in his E30, and like 50 people just came up to talk to me because all my neighbors are wondering, why the hell does this guy have all of his cars out and filming himself and acting weird and talking to the camera? But I'm pretty sure I just left off on the cooling system, so now we're going to move to the wiring. Now the wiring is much more difficult on the S54 than it is versus like an M50 or an M52 swap. I had a guy by the name of Andrew Harvey help me. He runs Harvey Racing LLC. He makes like the wiring harness adapters for like Kessel Performance, but he made me a wiring harness adapter that was $600. The next thing for the wiring and the DME side of things, the DME in an S54 has something called EWS, which you have to get deleted so the engine can start. Now, I actually have an MS54 HP DME, which is the upgraded E46 M3 DME that came out of the later years, like 2005 and 2006. I actually had a guy that I know tune it. He has a shop that does all BMW electrical work, coding, DME tuning. I'll link his website in the description. I shipped my DME out to him. Literally cost me 350 bucks. I got the top speed removed, rear O2 sensors removed, everything that needed to be removed, and he also installed an Alpha N tune for me so I can run my open velocity stacks. Also gonna need a E46 M3 gas pedal, which I have mounted in my car because the S54 runs off of a drive-by-wire system. So that's pretty much all the wiring covered up. Now let's move on to the exhaust. So for the exhaust, I'm gonna start with the headers and work my way back. For the headers, I actually have stock S54 headers. I just cut the cats off of them, then I made some pipes going down. Stock headers will cost you like $300. I have the cats cut off. You can sell the cats and then get your money back for the headers. For my exhaust system, I already had an exhaust made for this car. It's 2.5 inch, which I will be upgrading down the road to a full 3.5 inch because S54 is like a bigger exhaust to flow more exhaust gas. Because I weld and I TIG weld, I just made a full custom exhaust, which it only cost me a couple $100 just because I do all my welding. If you're having somebody else make your exhaust, expect to pay minimum $1,000 for a custom exhaust, parts and labor included. If you get something like really nice, hand TIG welded and everything, that can run you upwards of $3,000. I'm sure I'm missing a couple things, but that's pretty much basically gonna cover you getting your engine in your car and getting the car running and driving. Now for the total, it cost me around $11,600 to do the swap. I'm gonna add another $500 for that just for like little miscellaneous parts that I'm sure I'm forgetting. For now, I'm just gonna say $12,000 to do an S54 swap. Now that much money, you're gonna ask, is it worth it? Personally, I've driven an S54 Swap E30 before. I've driven this car. I'm still figuring out some issues on this car because I'm not 100% done on it. I'd say yeah, like if you guys have the money and you guys have the car, go out and do it. They absolutely rip. You know, if you strip out an E30, it's gonna weigh 2,400 pounds. And then if you properly tune the S54 with a good set of headers and a good intake or open trumpets, you're gonna be around 330 wheel horsepower. And that power, the high red line in this car is insane. If you guys have an E30 and have the money to do an S54 swap, I'd say go for it. But typically, an S54 swap on the cheap side will cost you around $15,000, you know, $12,000 to $15,000 if you're sourcing all your parts well. But I've seen S54 swaps get up to like $20,000 to $25,000 depending on what parts you're buying and if you're paying somebody else to do the work. But for me, it cost me around $12,000 and I'm doing all my own work. Okay, now we're moving on to the final part in the video. We're gonna answer some Q&A questions. I put a question thingy on my Instagram story, so if you guys aren't following my Instagram, go follow my Instagram because if you aren't, you're gonna be missing out on cool stuff every single day that I post on my Instagram. Tyler asked, what's my favorite car overall? That's a really, really hard question for me, especially because I like cars. Like, I like old cars, I like new exotic cars, I literally like everything. If I had to pick like my favorite older car overall, it would probably be an E30 M3 Evo 2, just because that's a car that got me into cars, was the E30 M3, just because it's one of the coolest looking cars of all time. Another Tyler asked, this is my friend Tyler, shout out to you Tyler if you're watching this video. What's your least favorite BMW series and why? I more or less like BMW M cars, just because who doesn't? You know, I have an E90 M3, I have an E30 with an S54 swap. I know it's not technically an M car, but it kind of is because it's pretty built up and it has an M engine in it. Least favorite BMW of all time, it's probably, I think it's the E67, or I forget, it's that one generation of 7 series, and they're terrible to work on. They're absolute junk. Moving on to the next question, Alex asks, when am I getting a 911? Because I love Porsche 911s and I really want a vintage air-cooled 911 just because I think they're so cool. I was about to buy an old vintage 911 race car, but it was a bit too much money for me to spend at the time. I could have bought it, but I didn't want to stretch myself that far. I'd say I'd want a 911, like an old air-cooled 911 in the next 2 to 3 years. John asks, how do you afford the E30? Which I'll come back to your question later because there's some more questions, which that question will tie into nicely. Marco asks, will it eventually go turbo? Pretty sure he's referring to the E30. For right now, I'm gonna say no. Just because I love NA engines so much and I love the sound of open trumpets, and you really can't beat that sound. Eventually, I think down the line, maybe, you know, let's say 4 years or something like that, if my channel's big enough and, you know, like my name's big enough, and let's say maybe I'm in SEMA or something like that, I would love to maybe do like a live to offend kit, which I'm not a fan of wide body kits, but the live to offend kits on E30s I think look ridiculously good, and maybe a turbo on it, because that would be an insane build. You know, an S54 with a turbo and an E30 with a live to offend kit, that would be literally my dream E30. Dominic asked me, what do I do to afford all of the projects? Awesome content, keep it up. Appreciate the comment. And there's a bunch of other questions asking me, what do I do for a living and how do I afford all of these cars, which I'll answer that for you right now. I'm a fabricator, I can weld. I'm really good at welding aluminum, really good at welding stainless. So I do a lot of side stuff like fixing cracked wheels, welding exhaust, a bunch of stuff like that, which I bring in money from. Kind of like buy and sell cars on the side a little bit. You know, I buy a car for X amount and then I sell it for more than what I bought it for. And I drive it around in the time being. And I'm also a tech at a friend of mine's shop. We specialize in European cars, mainly like German cars. I mainly work on all the BMWs, but we do BMWs, Porsches, Audis, Mercedes. I don't really like working on Mercedes or Audis, kind of junk. Sorry if that hurt any feelings. But yeah, I work there part-time. I do a lot of BMW work, so like hopefully in the next 2 to 3 years, my business that I'm kind of building right now, which has to do with BMWs and it has to do with parts, will start to come off the ground, and hopefully my audience will be big enough where they're gonna buy my parts. That's more or less my game plan. That's what I do for a living. I basically do BMWs for a living. I just work on BMWs and I fix BMWs. Isaiah, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name. He said, yo, I found your channel a couple of days ago. The vid of you when you drive the E30. That's a really good video. Binge watch your channel. I like your vids a lot, man. Keep it up. Dream so big it's scary. Yes, yes. 100K by the end of the year. For the Q&A, he asked, what's another dream swap than the S54 and an E30 chassis and engine? That's actually a really good question because I have so many crazy engine swap ideas. I want to put an S65 in an E36 M3 with a dual clutch. I think that would be insane just because I love the S65 and the 7-speed dual clutch. That's such a killer engine and transmission combination. One of my dream swaps, actually nothing to do with BMW. I love Italian cars too. I love Alfa Romeos and I love Ferraris. I'm just not into them just because they're really big money right now. Eventually, I'll get there. But my dream swap is actually an Alfa Romeo Quadrifoglio sedan with a Ferrari 458 engine in it. And those two would be insane because the Alfa Romeo Quadrifoglio is one of the best looking sedans in my opinion, just because, you know, it's an Italian design, one of these best looking cars in the world. The engine in it is cool, but it's a turbocharged V6, and I don't think Italian sports cars should be turbocharged. I think they should have a high revving NA V8, and I think that would sound absolutely insane. That's one of my dream swaps. But that's pretty much it from me in today's video. I appreciate you guys for watching so much. There is gonna be a video out soon on the E30 of us truly taking it out on the street and ripping it for the first time, coming up pretty soon. I just had a bunch of like stupid little issues here and there that I'm figuring out, and not really enough stuff to put in one video. And if I would, it would just be scattered all over the place and wouldn't make for a good video. But video up soon on the E30 of it actually running and driving and us properly ripping it. The E90 M3, we're gonna have so much good content coming on this car. I'm gonna get a bunch of titanium. We're basically gonna like do a full titanium custom exhaust. But thank you guys so much for watching. I'm gonna close the video out right now. As I always say, dream so big it's scary. Peace out, and I'll catch you in the next one.